Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade yet again, where today we are going to take a step back from the wider war, from the grand front line consisting of hundreds of millions of Imperial Guardsmen and entire divisions of the God Emperor's armies marching across a vast swath of the galaxy, and instead focus in on a single regiment and a single man who seems to always be popping up in the reports. Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt, fresh from his success on Fortis Binary, has managed to get himself involved in, well, frankly, some things that he probably should not have, as they are things pertaining to the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition, and not the business of average Imperial Guard commanders. Though, I do suppose in this particular case it was for the best that this average Imperial Guard commander was there to curtail the ambitions of one of my own. As, whilst of course the Inquisition always moves with the will of He on Earth, for it could not be otherwise, on occasion some go a little bit further than others, and cook up some rather harebrained schemes. That is exactly what happened with Gaulish Constantine Thepos Heldane. A name that may be familiar to some of you with higher security clearance, particularly in relations to the absolute disaster he was responsible for on the planet Gudrun with House Glav. Now, we shall not delve too deeply into events that took place on the other side of the galaxy, a long time before those currently transpiring in the Sabbat worlds. But it is necessary that you understand what kind of an Inquisitor Heldane was. For you see, whilst there are some in our ranks that prefer to operate as scalpels, there are others who prefer to operate as blunt instruments of the God Emperor's justice, and both have their times and place. The Hammer Inquisitor, as some derisively refer to them as, may at first appear to be simpletons, lacking in subtlety, incapable of the graces of more deceptive operations. And whilst for some this may very well be true, too much for some, certainly, the cudgel of the Inquisition is every bit as valuable as its scalpel. For you see, whilst the fine knife, the light instrument, is perfectly well suited to exorcising cancer before it spreads, if that malignant tumor has already run rampant throughout the body of one of the God Emperor's planet, then no amount of careful exertion will stop it from blooming into full-blown rebellion. No amount of careful assassination or clever counter-propaganda is going to stop an uprising that is already gathering its arms and readying itself for the day of destiny. What might very well, however, be able to stop even such a late-stage tumor from fully forming is the crushing might of the Imperial Guard being deployed against the planet, is pinpoint planetary barrages, is the destruction of entire hives, if need be, or civilizational centers from high orbit. A display of the absolute overawing might of the Imperium might just yet save the vast majority of such a world's population from the ultimate sanction of exterminatus. For as ever, of course, it is a poor craftsman indeed that blames his tools. A hammer and a scalpel are both fine instruments of the God Emperor's will, and it is up to us, his most favored of servants, to apply the one or the other as required. However, it must be admitted that some in the ranks of this most holy ordos tend to lean too much towards the one and not enough towards the other. Inquisitor Haldane was one of those. In fact, I am amazed that he was ever elevated to the rank of full Inquisitor in the first place. An action I attribute less so to any achievements on behalf of Haldane, and more so due to the weakness of his mentor, Commodus Woke. He was always a hopeless romantic, a Puritan's Puritan, the kind of Inquisitor who will simply not recognize the rot right beneath his own nose for all the perfume he sprays himself with. The kind of Inquisitor unwilling, or indeed perhaps simply unable, to do what is necessary. But we shall not continue to speak too ill of the dead. It is his previous pupil that is at the core of today's problem. You see, our Colonel Commissar had gotten his hand on something unusual, something he probably again should not have gotten his hands on. A data crystal that indicated a tremendous secret. A secret that the Colonel Commissar's absolute commander at the time, over the Crusade force that the Colonel Commissar was attached to, Lord High General Militant Hector Drevere, was not interested in having become public knowledge. Indeed, there were even attempts on the Colonel Commissar's life from officers appearing to hail from Hector Drevere's own counterintelligence forces. Now, it is not necessarily a rarity for the various intelligence arm of the Imperium to be shooting at one another, as there are a lot of secrets out there that various powerful men would prefer to see remain secrets. And any high-ranking Imperial Guard or Navy commander worthy of his salt is going to have his own intelligence units. Hector Drevere was no exception to this rule. In fact, he was practically a paragon of it, as his ambitions and his secrets were probably greater and darker than most. This also led his own intelligence units to rub up against the War Master's intelligence units, as their own spy operations had identified the outlines of Hector Drevere's plans, without being fully able to penetrate exactly what it was he was looking for, but they knew enough that he was probably in the initial phases of moving against the War Master. This, too, was hardly a major surprise. Hector Drevere was an extraordinarily driven and ambitious man, not to mention prideful. If there was any one of all the high commanders currently under the War Master's rule that would be likely to try something extreme, it probably would be Hector Drevere. Unfortunately for the War Master's intelligence services, they proved not quite as adept as their jobs as Drevere's men. They were uncovered and assaulted, largely wiped out, but one of them managed to pass on the information to an old friend, Ibrahim Gaunt. This was going to severely complicate things for Hector Drevere's counterintelligence units, for despite all of the obvious and inherent subtlety and skullduggery of Black Ops warfare, it is actually a surprisingly permissive environment, Both sides have a vested interest in ensuring that whatever goes on the back end does not enter the spotlight, so to say, as the average Imperial lasman easily gets discouraged if he starts hearing news of his superiors trying to kill one another. Not to mention the near inevitable legal entanglement that both sides will have to suffer from should it become common knowledge that one general is trying to shoot another general. It is therefore damn near universally understood that it is better to keep this stuff quiet, meaning that one Black Ops team can engage another one in, well, outright open warfare, with the mutual understanding that neither side is going to bring in any embarrassing outside eyes to what should be a private contest. The War Master's counterintelligence, however, had in essence violated that unspoken rule by passing on the information to Ibram Gaunt, who was of course not merely simply an outsider, but a Colonel Commissar in the Imperial Guard, complicating things twice over. Not only was he a fairly high-ranking Guard officer in command of, well, a reinforced regiment in essence, but he was also a member of the Commissariat. Now, at least, if the Colonel Commissar had had the good graces to simply perish in the crossfire between the War Masters and Hector Drevere's men, then, shit happens. And it does. With frightening frequency. There's more than a fair few war zones out there where the Imperial Guard seems to be as much at war with itself as the enemies of humanity, but details. As the Colonel Commissar, of course, did not have the good graces to simply keel over dead, as, well, acquiescing to his superior's wishes appears to be the one thing that the Colonel Commissar is absolutely firmly set against ever doing. And so now, for the time being at least, the information was outside of the grasp of Hector Drevere, but not necessarily out of the grasp of his allies. Having realized who held the information, Hector's foremost ally, Golesh Constantine Thepos Heldane of the Ordo Malus, decided to move against the Colonel Commissar on his own. Well, on his own, as in, he was doing it for Hector Drevere, but with the veneer of inquisitorial privilege, rather than necessarily acting on his de facto master's instructions. Though one could certainly delve into a discussion as to who was the master and who was truly the servant here. Clearly Heldane had come to the conclusion that, for one reason or another, it was not Makaroth, but rather this Hector Drevere that was the most likely to advance the cause of the Imperium in the Sabbat worlds. Now, considering the achievements of the War Master thereafter, this seems like a somewhat ludicrous idea, but it might also have to do with the final prize uncovered. Where Heldane did not necessarily believe that Hector Drevere was the right man for the job, but he did believe that he would be the most easily swayed and manipulated, therefore in essence placing not merely the power of the artifact in question, but of the entire Imperial Crusade in Heldane's arms, rather than that of the theoretical War Master-to-be. Tragically, yet again, however, the Colonel Commissar's reticence to obeying anyone who outranks him also includes the ranks of the God Emperor's Inquisition, and so despite a psychic assassination attempt and attempts to attack the Tarnis First and Only Regiment as well, via other puppet regiments under Heldane's command, both the Colonel Commissar and the regiment remained stubbornly alive. And worse still, it had not only alerted the Colonel Commissar to the fact that he was dealing with something even more problematic than merely an upstart general's counterintelligence units, But it had also overplayed the Inquisitor's hand. What he had engaged with, psychic assassination via proxy, is not, shall we say, standard or entirely sanctioned methodology. And very clearly, Haldane was engaged in far more naughty nonsense than merely that he didn't want anyone else to know about. For whilst, in theory, an Inquisitor's authority is limitless, that is only if they are willing to throw their Rosetta around. Haldane was not. And elected, therefore, instead, to lean on back and allow the Colonel Commissar to take him to the secret weapon instead, by assigning spies to the Tarnith first and making sure that their deployment on future war fronts would be closely studied and constantly, of course, surveilled. He didn't have to wait long either, as the next warfront was Menazoid Epsilon, exactly where the secret weapon was located. But Haldane did not know where, and so he had the Tarnith fully infiltrated, by having Gaunt meet an old friend. Convenient. Never trust attractive blondes who want to have dinner with you and talk about conspiracy theories, or old friends appearing at convenient times. It's pretty much universally a trap. But Gaunt didn't know that, and besides, even if he did, he had to commit to it. The very moment that his new watchers understood that he was not playing along was the moment that the Tarnith First was annihilated. But even if one is forced to step into a trap, does not mean that there is nothing one can do to prepare for it. During the previous action of the Ghosts, on the world of Fortis Binary, the Tarnith had developed a connection to another Imperial Guard regiment by the name of the Vitrian Dragoons. They were a particularly God Emperor fearing regiment with a strong sense of honor, exactly the kind of allies you would need if you're planning on doing something rebellious against your immediate superiors. Fortunately, the Vitrians, fortunately, due to a little bit more maneuvering in the back ends, more correctly, the Vitrians were assigned to operate alongside the Imperial Guard during the attack on Menazoid Epsilon. And to any outside observer, especially one familiar with Imperial Guard matters, the operation in and of itself appeared immediately suspicious. The Menazoid clasp was not of particularly vital strategic importance, and Epsilon was not, of course, even the system's capital, which was Menazoid Sigma, and yet Sigma was assigned only a relatively minor invasion force, whereas Epsilon, a seemingly insignificant speck in an already relatively insignificant system, a presumed shrine world of some sort to the Chaos deities, was assigned 28 regiments to seize the world on the ground. Now, the very fact that they elected to launch a ground invasion was strange in and of itself. This world had been designated a shrine world. Now, not necessarily a chaos shrine world, necessarily, but any shrine planet in this part of space would undoubtedly be viewed with significant suspicion. At the absolute least, the ruins discovered were of Xenos or non-imperial origin, and considering the Chaos forces had also hauled up on the planet en masse, it seemed eminently reasonable to suspect the world was of some significance to Chaos. But the orbital bombardment was not called in, instead the ground invasion was launched. In retrospect, of course, and to our informed eyes, this was because Hector Drevere hoped that his pet Inquisitor would lead him to the final prize, and his pet Inquisitor in turn hoped that the Colonel Commissar would lead him to his. In order to further assure that whatever was discovered on the planet would fall into the Inquisitor's hands, he assigned the Gentine Patricians Regiment, the Gentine First, also known as the Emperor's Chosen, to shadow the Tarnith. This was not exactly a maneuver resplendent with subtlety. In any way whatsoever. As well, firstly, it's not exactly standard Imperial Guard operating doctrine to place light scout infantry in front of and in the lead of the heavy assault specialists whilst attacking a fortified target. Nor is it normal to place two regiments that are in the middle of a blood feud within spitting distance of one another, as the Gentine and the Tarnith had both engaged in rivalries, lethal rivalries. Now, this in and of itself is hardly a rarity in the ranks of the Imperial Guard. There are plenty of regiments that just do not get along with one another. And the Tarnith Woodsmen and the Noble Patricians, well, that one does seem like a difficult fit. But this problem went far beyond merely your average dislike from one regiment to another, as the Gentine Patricians, of course, was the regiment commanded by General Aldo Decius, the man Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt had executed on the ice world of Kedar as revenge for leaving his father to die. Expecting treachery, therefore, the Colonel Commissar placed a single platoon under the command of Sergeant Blaine to act as a rear guard against their own allies, and instructed him to vox the Colonel Commissar the code word Ghostmaker, if/when the Patricians inevitably decided to betray them, whilst the Colonel Commissar and a group of his elite scouts pushed forward to locate whatever it was that everyone seemingly wanted to find on this ass end of nowhere planet, whose only seemingly noteworthy feature were tall stone and or metal pillars, creating a vast shrine-like structure visible from orbit. A very suspicious shrine-like structure that Hector Drevere elected to simply shove all of his men into. This was not a clever idea, but it was certainly on character for the Lord High General. Hector Drevere was not a sophisticated man, he was not a subtle man. He was, one could argue, an effective man, but that was about the highest praise anyone would reasonably give the man. We've talked about him previously. Of course, he views the Imperial Guard not even as a blunt object, but as a very large sausage, to be used to choke an enemy to death by shoving it down their gullet, hoping the enemy simply chokes to death before they're capable of eating all of their sausage. This was, however, to prove to be a particularly large and fatal mistake for the Lord High Militant, as he elected to descend onto the surface of the world personally and lead operations from the front. This, too, was an unusual choice for a man of Hector Drevere's reputation, but, well, we all at this point probably know why. And it's not like he was in any direct danger. He was surrounded by an enormous quantity of Imperial Guardsmen, and he was, of course, aboard his personal Command Leviathan super heavy forward command vehicle. What could possibly destroy such a behemoth construct? Alien technology could. As all of those mysterious stone pillars suddenly leapt into life, sending impenetrable force fields between the pillars, which in the best case scenario cut up all the Imperial Guard regiments into tiny isolated pockets to be picked off by enemy artillery, and units emplaced in the pillars themselves, or in worst case scenario, as seen with Hector Drevere's command Leviathan, they would shoot out and bisect men, tanks, and indeed Leviathans, seeing Drevere's career end in a vast cataclysmic explosion. Luckily for the Tarnith, they had received advanced warning of this, and had started placing demolition charges on the closest pillar, which meant that they were nowhere near as affected as most other regiments. An effort was of course made to communicate this information to the other regiments, but it was simply too late. By the time they got the radio communiques out, the interference was already so heavy, and the Imperial Guard units already so fully committed, that there was no hope of getting them into safety. The casualties in the first few minutes alone were horrific, both from the energy pillars activating and from the suddenly launched ambush that the Chaos Forces had prepared, as they had fully intended Menazoid Epsilon to be one enormous slaughtering yard for the Imperial Guard, the likes of Parthenop. But the Colonel Commissar was perfectly located to prevent this, even if he did not at the time know it. Deep beneath the ground, you see, he was advancing towards the secret weapons location, along with his traitorous friend, when he received the coded word Ghostmaker, as the Gentile patricians had apparently not really cared about the obvious betrayal, and had begun their own obvious betrayal as well on the command of Haldane, launching an attack upon the Tarnith rear guard. Initially, the patricians advanced cautiously, preparing fields of fire, bringing up their support weaponry, and advancing in the way they would against a heavily defended position. Which, in essence, was exactly what they were doing. The 50 men under Sergeant Blaine had had plenty of time to get dug in, preparing foxholes, fallback positions, camouflaged support weapons positions, and taking the maximum advantage of the slope that they were deployed on, they had already prepared lines of fire that would plunge down onto the advancing patricians. Initially, the patricians was not making it easy for them, as they were carrying out a proper assault, using bounding cover to keep the Tarnith's head down as they advanced. But they were taking annoying small casualties, which drove the patricians rather crazy. Their attack was being stymied and halted by mere peasant woodsmen, and the commander of the regiment, Colonel Flens, thus ordered a mass bayonet assault up a slope against prepared positions versus infantry armed with, fully automatic laser weaponry. It ended about the way you'd expect, with the patricians in their massed assault columns fording their way up the hillside and slaughtering the Tarnith at bayonet point. But before they got there, 50 lasguns on full auto will cut some pretty deep grooves into your average assault column, and the patricians lost nearly half their numbers, some 300 to 400 dead plus wounded. The only reason why they didn't suffer even worse was their expensive and admittedly effective war gear. But despite their sacrifices, they were now in a fine position to catch the Tarnith in the rear and unprepared, as the communications complications had extended to the rest of the Tarnith as well. Thus they were unlikely to have much in the way of advanced notice of the incoming betrayal. But this was also something the Colonel Commissar had planned for. When he received the code word Ghostmaker, he immediately sent out a signal of his own to be repeated continuously until it slipped through. This signal was intended for the Vitrian Dragoons, and once they received it, they knew that the patricians could no longer be trusted. And thus, just as the patricians were preparing to fall upon the Tarnith from behind, they themselves were assaulted from the rear by the Vitrians. And with nearly half their number dead, and probably twice that number again wounded, they did not stand a chance against a full-force regiment happening upon them from behind. Officially, I'm sure the Gentine patricians will be listed as honorably lost in combat, defending themselves and their comrades to the last man against treachery most vile and perfidious. Their banner of the mighty First will be carried back to their homeworld, Gent Normandius Prime, for the regiment to be resurrected and sent out to fight in the God Emperor's name yet again. That's how these things tend to go, but it's not always quite as true as the propaganda might wish for you to believe. Far more importantly, however, deep underground, the Colonel Commissar had come across the secret weapon, what appeared to be a standard template construct machine. Now, this alone would have made it incredibly valuable, as it did indeed appear to be largely intact. The Adeptus Mechanicus has carried out genocides for a hell of a lot less than that. But most remarkable of all was what the thing was apparently capable of producing. It was a standard template construct machine set up for the mass construction of men of iron. The automaton war machines that had brought an end to the glories of the Old Earth Federation. The military value of this discovery was incalculable. This was a force capable of bringing humanity at the absolute zenith of its power to its knees, reducing it to nothing more than scattered civilizations hunkering down across the galaxy, hoping for the storms that were ravaging it to end. It was a force near unimagined and unrivaled by anything else in the galaxy, quite potentially. Hell, even Tyranid Hive fleets might easily pale in comparison to entire armies of these automatons. And here was a standard template construct machine that could, in all theoretical essence, produce them indefinitely, so long as it was fed with resources. This was the weapon that Hector Drevere hoped would place him in the position of War Master, before he was obliterated by the trap he himself wandered into, that is, and the weapon, the secret that Haldane had far grander designs for. This could be a resurrection of humanity at its greatest. This could be the ultimate weapon against chaos. This could be the way to eradicate every vile Xenos strain from the galaxy. If it was truly intact, that is. The Colonel Commissar had his doubts. His friend, Farid, had none, as he was Haldane's psychic little puppet. He attempted to betray Gaunt, but in a brief yet intense firefight was defeated. And the death of Farid, his psychic puppet, also killed Haldane. This would normally be something that an Inquisitor could potentially survive, particularly someone as psychically sensitive and powerful as he, but he'd already taken a wound, attributed to a Tarnith sniper, during some of the aforementioned rivalry between the Patricians and the Tarnith, largely on Haldane's own instructions, and the psychic shockwave was too much for his body to handle. Which may or may not have caused a catastrophic explosion that may or may not have been more responsible for the whole Command Leviathan going boom thing, but you won't find that in any history books, so just ignore that part. This left the Colonel Commissar alone with the machine. He was, of course, more than capable of understanding the military implications of such a weapon, and if handed over to the War Master, perhaps the Sabbat World's Crusade could be finished with far less loss of life. Not to mention, in total, if an army of men of iron could actually be created again, it could be the Imperium's salvation. But this machine had also been sitting on a world that now very clearly bore the taint of chaos, and it had been sitting there for a very, very long time. The Colonel Commissar did not wait for the first man of iron to emerge from the machine before ordering it destroyed, and that was probably a good thing as well. God Emperor alone knows what could have been coming out of it. Not to mention the potentially even more catastrophic consequences of the enemy's Heritor College getting their hands on the machine. Some weapons are simply too dangerous to be allowed to exist, and this was almost certainly one of them. With the destruction of the machine in catastrophic fashion, the enemy's towers and pillars too began to collapse. The force fields penning the Imperial Guard in dissipated, and the ambushers became the ambushed, as predator became prey. As the Guard forces were able to easily wipe out the remnants of the Chaos forces, a relatively small group that had clearly intended to use the world's unique characteristics to make up for their limited numbers, and had nearly succeeded as well. Hector Drevere's death was hailed as due to enemy action, of course, as we have already covered, and he was given, if not a hero's funeral, then at the very least a worthy one, for the purposes of maintaining Crusade morale. He was dead now, so was the Inquisitor. There was no reason to embarrass anyone at this point in time, especially as it would have led to yet further uncomfortable questions as to the War Master's ability to lead. If he was inspiring revolts within his own ranks due to his inabilities, whether it be to convince his subordinates of his worth, or his inability to properly gauge their motivations and ambitions, then, well, that was a failure on his part. And the War Master's position was precarious enough as it was already. And of course, the embarrassing fact of the Inquisition's involvement in this whole scandal. Better to allow Golesh Constantine Phepos Heldane to be forgotten as an overzealous but still effective inquisitor, just as it is better that Hector Drevere become remembered as an overzealous yet effective commander, instead of insurrectionist traitors. As for the Colonel Commissar, well, at the very least he was no longer caught in between a War Master and a Lord High General Militant, with a bit of a Rosarius on his side, so he was no doubt pleased with himself, even if this success had cost the Tarnith dearly yet again. Platoons were hardly growing on trees for the Tarnith first, after all. And this would yet again, no doubt, bring the Colonel Commissar to the War Master's attentions, something that he would benefit from significantly in the distant future. But for now, we will leave the Sabbat worlds once again, and return to the broader scope of things, and forget all about this embarrassing little incident. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.